Part 7, Mixing and Mastering. In this segment, I want to share my mixing and mastering approach and sort of walk you through the different stages of my workflow. So this is more of an overview than a tutorial on how to mix. I won't get into much technical detail because there's lots of YouTube content out there already. I think it's more valuable to talk about general principles anyway, because when people struggle with mixing, it's usually not because they don't know how to use an EQ or a compressor or things of that nature, but rather they get lost because they're lacking orientation. They just don't know where they are and which direction to go. So it's much easier to mix a song when you have some sort of direction, right? At least that's what helps me anyway. All right, let's begin with the mindset. I actually covered most of the mindset and philosophy in the first and second part of the series. If you haven't already, please go back and watch those. They are absolutely fundamental to the way this works, because from my point of view, it's all about paying attention to context and really understanding the nature of audio and how we as humans perceive audio. The reason why I talked about context and themes so early on in the series is because it helps to make decisions in this pool of limitless possibility, right? It helps you to make mixing decisions, composition decisions, sound choice, and so on. So once you're clear about your theme, you're not too overwhelmed by possibilities anymore, and all of a sudden you got some sort of direction, you know? Instead of getting caught up in details, you're actually looking at your song from above, so to speak. You're looking at it from a higher level. Mixing and mastering can be approached in different ways. Obviously, most commonly it appears to be very technical, but it doesn't have to be that way. If you want it to be that way, you can, but it doesn't have to be. Sure, there's technical aspects going along with this, so you have to know how an EQ works and how to compress and stuff like that, but in my opinion, it's secondary. There's no right way to mix. There's certainly a couple of wrong ways to do it, as you probably already experienced, but there's no one right way, okay? The level of technical complexity will also depend on what type of person you are. If you're kinda nerdy, go nuts, bro. If you're more of a dreamer, fucking go dream, alright? Your approach to your art should depend on who you are as a person, because at the end of the day, you want to make authentic art. At least I assume that's the case. So you have to kind of listen to your gut and be a little more intuitive about your approach, even if it comes to mixing and more quote-unquote technical subjects. For instance, I'm a rather intuitive person, so getting too technical with things isn't always that helpful. Sure, I have this side of me that, I sometimes go into those sort of areas, but not always, and not for the bigger picture, right? And if you are an intuitive person as well, it's actually more helpful for us to work within a narrative framework rather than cold facts. Because we think in stories and symbols, and that's why a narrative and a direction is so important. That's why I talked about themes so much. That being said, mixing became a very simple game to me once I began to view my song as one coherent organism that's made up of living parts. So every part has certain characteristics and interacts with the other elements. It's almost like a living cell or a body or a family. You know what I mean? So it's an interactive living system. See, to the more technically minded people among us, this probably sounds like utter nonsense. But to me, this is how I organize my thinking, right? So like I said, to me, a project is a living being. So mixing then is all about maintaining homeostasis, balance and shit like that. Again, really paying attention to context. To me, mixing is a very gentle sort of process and has more to do with careful selection rather than trying to fucking forcefully shape stuff into a form. Like you see some guys trying to cut off the transients and make stuff as loud as possible. And this is sort of a very hard approach to mixing that I personally cannot resonate with. I do it my way, which is a little more gentle, but you have to do you. If you want to make club bangers, of course, man, fuck the transients, fuck dynamics. But if you want something more natural, more dynamic, then maybe change your process accordingly. You will see that there's not a lot of effects and plugins on my channels, because as I mentioned before, a couple of segments back, the elements I combine with each other are the mix, okay? And all the rest is just, equalizing and detail work. All you need for a rough mix are the volume knobs. Beginners often jump to EQ and compression and all sorts of fancy plugins because the marketing department of those software companies did a great job convincing you that your mix won't sound professional without them. And that, of course, is a scam, which you will sooner or later find out. Stock plugins are usually all you need, especially if it's just the basics, right? Because any experienced mixing engineer can achieve a better mix with the volume faders alone than you could with your entire toolbox. It's true. The reality is, most of the mix is about finding the right volume for each element, and the rest is detail work. Of course, this is an oversimplification. It's a little more complicated than that, but my point is that the answer is in the basics. Beginners often discount the basics and jump to the fancy plugins, but you have to nail the basics before everything else because your foundation has to be strong, right? No need to make a science project out of every beat you make. I've made this mistake before and it just slows you down. It just makes things more complicated, but not necessarily better. Anyway, let's get to the actual process. There's a couple stages or milestones to my projects. I talked about this roadmap of how I finish a project from start to finish in one of my podcasts. The link to the episode is in the description below. This is a great additional resource for those struggling to find a way out of unfinished projects. Having a map with different milestones really helps to orient yourself in case you're getting lost a lot. And that way I always know where I am and what the next step is or what I need to do before I hit the next landmark, so to speak. I'm not being too strict with those milestones. These are just rough suggestions. For the most part, I mix as I go, meaning whenever I add a new element, I make sure it already sounds good and it roughly fits into the mix. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's more fun, honestly. It's more satisfying to build a track when it already sounds somewhat decent in the demo stage, so I'm way more motivated to actually finish the song. The second reason has to do with our brain. Again, I touched on this before. Since our brain adapts very quickly to environments, it's a good idea that it better adapts to a version that already sounds acceptable. So there won't be any major surprises later in the process. Because the deeper you are into the project, the more difficult it will become for your brain to accept major changes. So anyway, milestone number 1 is my kick drum. I call it the -6 dB North Star. What this means is, once I decided on a kick drum, I make sure it peaks at about -6 dB. This is kind of like a North Star that all other elements align to. Now, why the kick drum and why -6 dB? The number is somewhat arbitrary. Most mastering engineers want you to deliver a -6 dB mixdown so they have enough headroom to work with. In my case, unless it's a remix, I am my own engineer, so it doesn't really matter that much, but either way, it's a good practice to keep the output consistent, because if your projects are always at different levels randomly, it makes it really difficult to stay consistent with your mixing, because your ears perceive frequencies very differently depending on how loud it is. So having a somewhat consistent exposure will lead to better mixing decisions overall in the long run, so keep that in mind. Also, that way you can work with your templates and only have to do minor tweaking every time you do your mastering instead of reinventing the wheel every damn time. So I do this for continuity reasons. Try to think long term here. The reason why I use the kick drum as a reference element as opposed to the clap or whatever is that the kick is usually one of the first elements I add to the beat, and it is also the loudest element in the mix, at least for most of the music that I make. So when my kick peaks at -6 dB and I align everything to this kick, my overall mixdown usually hits just around that as well. Milestone number 2 is sidechaining. At this point I already have a beat going, maybe some synths and a vocal or some other elements that need to be sidechained to the drums. And I set up my sidechaining very early on because it's such an important factor to the sound, so I want to make sure that I nail that before my brain adapts to a version without this effect. I covered my sidechaining technique in the drums episode, so if you haven't watched this, go back and watch it. I do this just quick and dirty. Everything just goes into one channel, like fuck it. It's not important to me to have it neat and tidy just yet. I'm still in the beginning stages of the song, so I don't want to waste my time with technical details before I commit to the song, so to speak. Once I set up the sidechain, I start writing the song. Actually, it will take a while now before I hit the next milestone. So this is now writing phase, just arranging and stuff like that. Those first 2 milestones are done very early in the process, usually within the first hour or so. So I'm still in 8-bar loop land, no arrangement at this point. And the next milestone is days, maybe weeks away. So a couple of sessions later, with all the arrangement and actually producing the song, once I feel like I got all the elements I need for the song and I don't need to add anything else in order to finish the song, I start with milestone number 3, the cleanup. This is where I set up the project in a way that I can actually start mixing it down and producing it properly. This is a very important milestone. I only do this for tracks that I'm committed to finish and release. And this stage is about reducing and simplifying the project file. And here's how I do it. So the first step is to purge all unused clips. First, I make sure that I delete all the clips and samples that aren't actually in use. You know, sometimes you add some layer or some sounds that you end up ditching, but it's still in the project somehow taking up space. So I do it like this. First, I get rid of all of the deactivated clips, so the muted ones. To do this, I go to the little drop down on the upper left corner of the playlist, choose select, then select muted, and now I hit delete. And this removes all of the deactivated clips. So as you can see, there's no muted clips in the playlist anywhere. Then you go to tools, macros, and click on purge unused audio clips. And this gets rid of all of the audio samples here that aren't in the playlist. And keep in mind, this doesn't affect muted clips, so that's why we needed to get rid of those first. Now, step 2 is to remove all unnecessary layers and sounds. So the first step is kind of an automatic way to get rid of things that you weren't using anyway. And the second step is a little more of a conscious effort, because, you know, I like to layer stuff and add some sounds to, you know, fill up the space, make it sound more rich and thick and whatnot, but not every single layer actually contributes to the sound. Now, go through all the elements one by one and decide whether or not you really need that sound in there. Like, does this element contribute to the song or not? And a good way to test this is to mute that element and see if it made any difference. Like, if it barely did, I remove it. If I can barely notice that element missing, then it's gone. Because the more elements I have, the more time I also need to invest in mixing. And it tends to get muddier the more elements you have, and it becomes harder to mix. Now that I cleaned everything up, I can start with step number 3, which is mixer routing. So once I committed to all of the elements, I'm ready to route everything into the mixer properly. Now that I went through every single element one by one in step 2, I know what's in the project, and I already kind of organized the sounds in groups mentally. Some of the elements are already wired into the mixer, but it's usually messy and everything is going into one fucking channel, but that's okay. I allow myself to be messy during that phase, because after all, why would I go through all the trouble if I don't even know if I'm committed enough to finish the project, you know? So anyway, I use my mixer template for this. You can download it if you like. The link is down below. I'll explain the template and the system behind it in a bit. For now, all you need to know is that there's 6 different colors here, and they represent 6 different groups, which will then be bounced as stems and then used for mastering. Group number 1 is the kick drum. Group number 2 are drums. The third group is the sub bass. Group 4 are main synths. Group 5 is miscellaneous stuff. Group 6 are effects, and group 0 are vocals, because I don't always have vocals, so that's kind of an optional group. Once I'm done with the routing, I rearrange the playlist to match the mixer. I touched on this in the first segment where I talked about order, and this is just a way to stay consistent with my organization of project files. It's the internal logic of the project. Also, the mapping makes sense now. So, for example, if I'm looking for my, let's say, sub bass, all I have to do is to look for blue elements somewhere between the drums and the synth, both in the mixer and the playlist. So it inhabits the same conceptual space, so to speak. So I don't have to think twice. I only have one system. It goes from kick, drums, sub bass, synths, miscellaneous, effects, vocals, and that's it. And the last step is going through every single channel and apply effects like EQ and tweak each channel's stereo separation, make sure everything sounds the way I want it to. So this would be the actual quote-unquote mixdown stage, but at this point I usually done most of the work because, like I said before, I mix as I go. Anyway, after this, the mix is ready and I can bounce stems. Working with stems has a couple of advantages. First, you will always be able to recreate the track no matter what, even if you lose the project or you move things around and the project can't load up properly because you made an update or plugin stopped working for whatever reason. Also, you can send the stems off to other artists to request remixes, and it can really help you from a mindset perspective to do your arrangement, mixing and mastering in separate projects because you're changing environments, you're changing mindsets. Okay, so let me go through my mixer template real quick. I like to split my songs into 6 to 7 groups. The number proved to be the right one for me. You need to look for yourself what makes sense to you. I personally don't like exporting way too many stems, like 20 stems or whatever. It just gets messy in its own way. Sure, you have more control, but I already fixed most of the stuff in my arrangement file. On the other hand, doing less than 6 stems leaves me with very little room for execution, so 6 to 7 stems is the right amount for me. So the way I group my stems depends on semantics, frequency content, and dynamic range. So group number 1 is the kick drum. It's separate to the rest of the drums because later in the mastering file I will group the kick and the sub bass together so I can process the entire accumulative low end. Group number 2 are drums. Frequency-wise, it's all across the board, but in terms of dynamics, it's pretty distinct from the other stems. There's many sharp transients and they need special treatment. I want my drums to sound coherent as a group, so I like to process them together. The only exception to this are the kick and crashes. My crashes actually don't go into the drums group, they go into the effects group, because again, of frequency and dynamic content. My effects group is mostly white noise and stuff like that, lots of top end, not a lot of transients, and that's why it needs much different effect settings than the drums group. So that's why my crash go to the effects group. Group number 3 is sub bass, pretty self-explanatory. All of the low frequency content goes here. Group number 4 are main synths. Those are usually chords and stuff like that. Frequency wise, very heavy on the mid-range. In terms of dynamics, it's rather flat. Group 5 is miscellaneous stuff. This could be all sorts of organic instruments. This could be a flute or a cello or guitar in this case. So frequency wise, it's mids and top end. It usually has more dynamic range than the synth group. Group number 6 are effects. Like I said, mostly sweeps and noises and effects type of stuff. Lots of top end, not a lot of dynamics. And the last group are vocals. Obviously, I want to process them separately and not throw them into some group carelessly. And this is usually the stem that people request when they want to do a remix, right? So there's one channel per stem over here on the right hand side, and these used to be send channels, but I made them just into regular channels that go into the master directly. And these are the channels that we're gonna export as stems. As you can see, none of those channels here go into the master. They all go into their respective group channel on the right. And the way to export stems now is to click on these ARM disk recording buttons over here. As you can see, it lights up in red. Go to the upper left corner of the mixer, click on that drop down, go to disk recording and render to WAV files. Then this menu pops up where you select your options and then you could hit start. But before you do that, you need to specify where those stems go because by default it saves them somewhere in the Nirvana. So to declare destination, press F11, go to the project tab, click on the little folder icon here and navigate to your destination folder. And now you can actually go back, hit render, and it renders all of those 7 stems in one fell swoop. And now you're ready for mastering. My approach to mastering is basically make the mix as good as you can and then make it louder without fucking it up. And that's basically it. I used to send my stuff off to mixing engineers and mastering engineers, but most of the time I didn't really like the way it sounded. Usually things come back way too compressed for my taste. I like my masters to be a little bit more dynamic, so there's not a lot of work left for the mastering engineer actually that would justify the cost. So That's why I'm doing it myself. Sure, I'm probably on the losing end of the loudness war, but I'm not really competing against anyone in my mind. Like, I have my own fucking shit going on. I mix music for myself. Some people fuck with it, some don't. I don't care. If it sounds good to me, that's all I care about. And I'm glad that some people also think that it sounds good. But loudness just isn't that relevant of a factor to me personally. Anyway, my mastering workflow is pretty straightforward. I have separate project files for my arrangement and mastering because back in the day I couldn't do it all in one project due to CPU reasons. Things would just crash or go really slow. Nowadays I could do it all in one, but I stuck to that approach because I feel like I'm in different modes of production. It's two completely different mindsets. So the first step is to check every single stem by itself in solo. Sometimes there's mistakes that I didn't catch in the arrangement, and you can only see and hear it in the audio print sometimes, you know. If I catch a mistake, I either fix it in here if it's just a minor bug, or go back to the arrangement file and fix it there and then re-export the stems. This can be a little bit of a back and forth depending on the song, but this is really important because I catch mistakes here that I wouldn't have catched otherwise. Then next step is to multiband compress the kick and the sub bass. So I route the kick and the sub to one group channel and then compress the low end only. It's almost like a dynamic EQ. So whenever the kick and bass hit together, the bass frequencies pile up and then the compressor kicks in and tames that frequency range a little bit. That way I can make the sidechain a little bit less aggressive and make those two elements sit nicely in the mix together without too much of that sidechain pumping. I have a multiband compressor on almost every stem just to tame the frequency content of that group that tends to get out of hand. So for the drums, for example, it's usually the top end that's acting up. The synths usually pile up in the lower mids. And compressing each stem and taming the dynamics a little bit before they hit the limiter just tends to give me better results than going straight to the limiter. And the last step is literally just a limiter. And that's it. Pretty basic. I use a free limiter number 6. It's like a Russian plugin or whatever. It does the trick. You can use the stock plugin or use Waves plugins. I can't really hear the difference. To me, this sounds fine and nobody ever complained. So, alright, that's it for mixing and mastering. My approach isn't the end-all be-all by any means. I'm sure some people will be surprised how little technical knowledge goes into my approach. But if you heard something that made sense to you, feel free to adopt it, of course. See you in the next episode where we wrap the series up and talk about finalizing and releasing projects.